Shalom. This week we are reading Parashat Eikev. And remember, as we've been discussing, the whole of Sefer Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, is preparation for coming into the land of Israel, for the nation of Israel to come into the land that was promised to her, bequeathed to her by the God of Israel. And this parsha, again, is all about the mitzvot. And specifically, it's about the relationship, our relationship with Hashem. It's about Israel's relationship with God and with the land. There's like a knot that binds together Hashem, Israel, Torah, and the land. And that knot is becoming tighter. And they are clearly here demonstrated to be one indivisible unit. I read here in the beginning of chapter 8, the entire commandment that I command you today, you shall observe to perform, so that you may live and increase, and come and possess the land that the Lord swore to your forefathers. So, one indivisible unit. This parsha begins with blessings, material blessings, children, and the parsha just emphasizes over and over again the mitzvot and the land, the commandments and the land, the entire commandment, as we read. If I was to ask you, what do you think is the mission and purpose of every human being? What should be seen? What is really the goal of human existence? Torah teaches us that the goal of human existence for all people is to be near to God. Now, the people of Israel accepted upon themselves the responsibility to guarantee that all humanity can realize this goal. And the specific dynamic of the relationship between Israel and God as this nation fulfills God's commandments in the land that He has brought them to, that is designed to bring blessing to the entire world. And the very reality of this relationship is proven by the sheer fact that God promised and gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. And make no mistake, the entire relationship that this nation, the nation of Israel, has with this land is based solely on the covenant that God made with our forefathers, a covenant that places us entirely in the service of God. Failure is not an option. And non-compliance is not an option. There is no other reason for Israel to be in this land. The nation's purpose for entering into this land, we read over and over again in this Torah portion. Purpose for entering into this land and living here is the faithful fulfillment of the Torah. And indeed, the land promised by God was only promised in connection with our covenant and our commitment to the Torah. And this parsha makes this amply clear, that it is the Jewish national calling to come into this land and obey God's commandments. And how many times do we read about this? As I read previously, the entire commandment that I command you today, you shall observe to perform, so that you may live and increase and come and possess the land that Hashem swore to your forefathers. Chapter 11, for example, we read, so you shall observe the entire commandment that I command you today, so that you will be strong, and you will come and possess the land to which you are crossing, to possess it, so that you will prolong your days on the land that Hashem swore to your forefathers to give them and to their offspring, a land flowing with milk and honey. You know, this is very serious stuff. This bond. There's the God of Israel, there's the nation, and there is our obligation to a way of life in this land. And there are even opinions amongst the greatest sages of Israel of all times. I'm sorry, I have to tell you, there are opinions that these commandments are only to be performed in this land, and that they have no real significance being performed outside the land, other than to keep them alive, to remember how to perform them, other than just practice. And actually, when we read these verses, sorry, but I don't see anything here about performing these commandments anywhere else on earth. I don't see anything else here. God doesn't tell us anything here about living this type of life outside the land. So here in Parshat Eikev, the first thing that we encounter is the blessing, a reward, as it were. And we read, "And it will be, because you will heed these ordinances and keep them and perform, that the Lord your God will keep for you the covenant and the kindness that he swore to your forefathers. And he will love you and bless you and multiply you. He will bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your soil, your grain, your wine and your oil, the offspring of your cattle and the choice of your flocks in the land which he swore to your forefathers to give you. And you shall be blessed above all peoples. There will be no sterile male or barren female among you or among your livestock. And the Lord will remove from you all illness and all of the evil diseases of Egypt, which you knew, he will not set upon you, but he will lay them upon all your enemies." So we have here a promise of prosperity, which ostensibly first appears to be two different blessings, fruit of the womb and the fruit of the land. But actually, it's not two different blessings, it's one blessing. The definition of blessing that we are receiving here, and in fact the reward itself, is to bring more and more children into the world, to be an ever-increasing nation of pure and spiritual and moral souls. That is how God's land, founded on the keeping of the Torah, flourishes. And parallel to that blessing of children goes the ever-increasing blossoming of the riches of the soil, the blossoming of the land, and its fruit and its produce is commensurate to the population's need. But here you see the blessing that distinguishes this nation that lives under the regime of Torah from all other nations is the blessing of having children. And do we really understand this? Do we really know this? Because this is the Torah's lesson here, that there's nothing more precious than a human soul, and the number of their increase is the measure of our true national happiness. But then, after being told that that is the very definition of blessing and the reward itself, all of a sudden, in verse 16, we are told, "And you shall destroy," the word is actually consume in Hebrew, "all the nations that the Lord your God gives you, and your eye shall have no pity on them, so that you shall not serve their gods, for it is a snare to you." That's the verse. The verse literally tells us, verse 16, "And you shall consume all the peoples which the Lord your God gives you. You shall not spare them," is one translation, but the words in Hebrew actually mean, "Your eye shall not pity them, nor shall you worship their gods, for that will be a snare for you." Now this seems strange. Your eye shall have no pity on them? Is that a nice thing for God to tell the Jewish people? Just after the promising of the blessing of life, and just after emphasizing that the most valuable and precious thing of all, the very measure of blessing, is children. How are we to understand? Is this the God of love? Is this God's instructions to his people? Your eye shall have no pity on them? There's only one reason why we need this admonition. Because we need it. Because not showing mercy to an enemy goes so against the grain of the Jewish people and is so not what they were meant to be, and so not who they are, which is to be the champion of all living creatures, that's why it's precisely why it was necessary for God's Torah to stress and emphasize this admonition for Israel to understand that this particular merciless purging of the Canaanite population is an exception expressly commanded by God at his order because of who God determined that they had become, an inverse image of humanity. And why are we told here that Israel is not to spare them? Because of their gods that will be a snare. Numerous times in this week's Torah portion, we are told that there is nothing to fear from our enemies. That the avowed enemies of Israel are not even an issue. They're not even there. Read these verses. Read here. Chapter 7 and verse 18. Do not fear them. You shall remember what Hashem your God did to Pharaoh and to all of Egypt, the great test that your eyes saw, and the signs, the wonders, the strong hand, the outstretched arm with which Hashem your God took you out. So shall Hashem your God do to all the peoples before whom you fear. And then again we read in, for example, chapter 9. Hear, O Israel, today you cross the Jordan to come and drive out nations that are greater and mightier than you, cities that are great and fortified up to the heavens, a great and lofty people, children of giants, that you knew and of whom you have heard. Who can stand up against the children of the giants? But you know that Hashem your God, He crosses before you a consuming fire. He will destroy them and He will subjugate them before you, and you will drive them out. And again we read these promises from the Almighty. So that's not the issue. There's no one to fear. What is the issue? What can drive a wedge between Israel and God? What are the dangers for which we might lose this land? All forms of idolatry and heathenism. This is what we read here in the very beginning of the Torah portion. You will devour all the peoples that Hashem your God will deliver to you. Your eye shall not pity them. You shall not worship their gods, for it is a snare to you. We are warned here in the Torah portion of two things. One is all forms of idolatry, and two is forgetting Hashem Himself, the lure of prosperity, and forgetting that it was Hashem who did all of this for us, because that forgetting alone can bring us to idolatry. And so we read, take care, lest you forget Hashem your God, by not observing His commandments, His ordinances, and His decrees, which I command you today, lest you eat and be satisfied, and you build good houses and settle, and your cattle and sheep and goats increase, and you increase silver and gold for yourselves, and everything that you have will increase, and your heart will become haughty, and you will forget Hashem your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt. And then we read, it shall be that if you forget Hashem your God and go after the gods of others and worship them and prostrate yourself to them, I testify against you today that you will surely perish. Like the nations that Hashem causes to perish before you, so will you perish, because you will not have hearkened to the voice of Hashem your God. There is a very unique ecosystem here in the land of Israel. It's called holiness. And the fate not only of Israel, but actually of the entire world, hangs in the balance. Israel in this land has to focus. There is only her obligation to her God, and everything else is illusion. This parsha is so much about the connection between the land and the commandments, but we're also reminded here of the whole experience that we had in the desert wanderings. And we read, every commandment that I command you this day you shall keep to do, that you may live and multiply and come and possess the land that the Lord swore to your forefathers. And you shall remember the entire way on which the Lord your God led you these 40 years in the desert, in order to afflict you, to test you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. And He afflicted you and let you go hungry, and then fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your forefathers know, so that He would make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but rather by whatever comes forth from the mouth of the Lord does man live. What is this idea that we are told here, that these 40 years in the desert were to test us, to know what is in our heart and whether or not we will keep the commandments? And then this unusual idea that God says He afflicted us and then let us go hungry The word in Hebrew is actually he starved us, and then he fed us with the manna. That experience is branded into our DNA. The way that we were fed by God in the desert was an experience that changed our entire essence. And it's with us today. Our understanding of how God relates to us, how everything comes from Him, and everything else is an illusion. And the Parsha ends with a very great promise. We read, "Then Hashem will drive out all these nations from before you, and you will possess nations greater and stronger than you. Every place upon which the soles of your feet will tread will be yours. From the desert and the Lebanon, from the river, the Euphrates River, and until the western sea will be your boundary. No man will stand up before you. The Lord your God will cast the fear of you and the dread of you on all the land upon which you tread, as He spoke to you." What a promise that is. I mean, if someone made a promise like that to you, wouldn't you try to do your part to receive it? Shouldn't this promise be worth everything in the world? And notice there's no mention here regarding the boundaries of the land of Israel, from the Euphrates to the western sea, every place that the sole of our feet tread, not fearing before any man. There's no mention here of Obama, Congress, the EU, or the IAEA, or the Ayatollah, or for that matter Netanyahu. There's only one caveat for total security, peace, and prosperity. And that happens to be, at the same time, the very reason for our existence and the sole legitimacy for Israel being in this land. For if you keep all these commandments which I command you to do them, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all His ways, and to cleave to Him, that is the whole story. And everything else is meaningless and empty. All else is an excuse. We don't really need any excuses. Enough with the excuses. Israel doesn't need any excuses because God is with us as we embrace this Torah in His land.